Okay, this lecture is going to be on more of the process of developing, excuse me, the PowerPoint. So I'll do another PowerPoint that goes through the actual material as well. So in this PowerPoint, I'll be flipping back and forth between the web and the PowerPoint and the initial PowerPoint, uh, this one, to show kind of how they all work together. So I have a title. I'll also be talking about shortcomings in my PowerPoint. Well, where'd my first? There we go. So there's my title. What it should also include that I'm missing here is that uh, it's by me. So make sure that you include who the authors are of this material. So then as it starts, I have the basic mechanism of diabetes and what I think is important or what is important. So I talk about insulin, and then I talk about the etiology. So what does it mean to have diabetes, and what are the main things you need to know about what's physiologically happening in the body. So make sure that you talk about that. Well, this thing doesn't want to move from slide to slide. Okay, so what I also do, and this is difficult for me, but I also include videos associated with the etiology. So you would just copy and paste that into your web browser, and then just go from there. So, and as you're doing this, one thing that I did not do that you should do, so I would take off points for this, is you should also include a reference of where you got the material from. This is a shortcoming of mine. I put things together and I read it and put together the materials, but I don't necessarily put together put the bibliography or the reference. So make sure that you're putting the reference. And when you're doing the search, you could try various different search terms. I think if you just put diabetes, it helps to spell it right. In this case, you'll get a lot of good information that you could then use that will give you what you need. Sometimes you can add an extra term, and that will give you a more refined definition. For some things, especially these major disease topics, you could go with just the term, and that will give you a lot of information. But if that is not giving you the information you want, then refine that search for sure. So what I also put in was the diabetes mechanism. So make sure that you're following what is here. I have the etiology. So group 1 is doing everything. Everybody will do group 1. So that's the. But the etiology. What is the disease? Come on. What is the disease progression? What is the role or the effect of early detection, and how many diseases are lumped into one category. You can add additional things to that as well. So one of the things that I added was what is the mechanism for how diabetes occurs, and really for how complications occur. Because having high blood sugar is one thing, but then how that high blood sugar causes you to have problems is really what's more important. So you want to discuss that and talk about that. You don't want to just talk about the basic mechanism of what is insulin and that it causes high blood sugar, more insulin to be released, and what's happening at the level of the pancreas. The problems with diabetes can be related to pancreatic failure, but oftentimes it's related to something else. So you want to talk about that something else. So make sure that you're thinking about your disease topic and really what's the endpoint that is the most worrisome. And when you describe the etiology, get to that endpoint. So don't just talk about what is initially happening. Keep going through that logical progression to say, okay, well, this is why this is bad. So you could talk about high cholesterol, and you could talk about how high cholesterol occurs, but then you would need to talk about at some point how that can potentially lead to a stroke, or how that can lead to a heart attack. That's the end point, and you've got to describe and discuss the mechanism to get to that point. So make sure that you're doing that as well. So that's what I have here, the complications. I found a nice article. I did a search of how does high blood sugar damage blood vessels. So I just put that search term. And then that came up with various articles and various information. So I got this article that I found that was very informative. So then this article kind of goes through what's happening and how the blood vessels are being damaged. Now, in here, some of the details are difficult to understand. This section right here, I'll get rid of that because you probably can't see it when I highlight it, but that glucose levels affect the vasodilator nitric oxide, which NO2 explode. Those types of supplements, we're trying to increase that. Is a shortfall, and that risks or increases blood pressure, that narrows the blood vessels, and that's causing damage over time. And it describes it later here, that causes deterioration of those blood vessels. Some of the details that are here you're not going to understand. I don't know what this OG, LC, NAC levels. I have no idea what that is, but what's important for you is to talk about basically what's going on, as well as to realize that, okay, there is a mechanism here. I might not understand the mechanism, and even I, who have a good background in this, don't quite have difficulty following the mechanism, so I can make that general assumption that most everybody else has difficulty following that mechanism, and that's okay. But that you realize that there is a mechanism, that this has been figured out, and there is a biologic plausibility that's there, even if you don't quite understand it. Okay, so I list the complications. And then I talk about early detection. So what's ever here, if you cover more than this, that's great. And especially if you have a logical progression in your mind and you add those things in, you should add those things in. But at least make sure that these things are clearly, and you do it clearly by your titles, clearly addressed, so that it's easy to see, okay, this is where this topic is addressed. So I talk about the early detection and the early symptoms, and the how type 2 diabetes is defined. I had this chart from the book. If you need a chart from the book, let me know and I can send them to you. Also, if you want to copy and paste from an internet website, I didn't do a great job of having extra pictures and things like that in there. I do have some videos. If you find good videos, make sure that they're in the appropriate spot. But if you have pictures, other people are much better at putting in pictures than I am and finding pictures. But I got this from the textbook, so including these is good and beneficial. Then I list the symptoms. I mentioned here type 1 diabetes just because Those are symptoms that are readily out there, and sometimes type 2 diabetics will have those symptoms as well, especially if they're in pancreatic failure. But generally, stay on task with the topic you're discussing. I mention it here, but I don't mention it again. So be careful of what you're doing. If you're narrowing your topic and you're only talking about one thing, make sure that you concentrate on that one thing and don't start going into detail about something else. So I mention it here because the symptoms can be the same for type 1 and type 2. But generally, I don't talk about type 1 because it's going to confuse the issue. So I talk about that. I give the basic definition of type 1 just because I talked about it earlier. I also have this, how many diseases are lumped together in one category. So I mentioned the different diseases that are also called diabetes. So lifestyle treatment, I mentioned these here and then I talk about them in a little bit more detail later, but these are the general lifestyle treatments, which again is this next slide. What is the treatments? So what are the therapeutic modalities? I mentioned the lifestyle issues because they're especially important for diabetes, but that's where I kind of end. I got this diagram or graph from the book, and it just shows you what is going on if you have normal weight, overweight, obese, and whether they are fit or unfit. So you can see that if you're normal weight, so a body mass index under 25, that's really pretty much the biggest predictor of whether or not you're going to have diabetes. Now, if you're fit, it lowers it even more. And if you're a little bit overweight and you're fit, then that's pretty much on the same level as somebody that's unfit but normal weight. So you can kind of see how these things work together. And this is where the fit fat comes into play, where you have, even if you're obese but you're fit, your risk is much higher, but it's still much lower than if you're obese and unfit. So I list the medications, what's the basic mechanism, what's going on there. These are important to know. They're important to look up and find the information. I mention surgeries. Mainly I mention bariatric surgery. Generally there is no surgery for type 2 diabetes. For type 1 diabetes, you can get a pancreas transplant theoretically, but generally there's not much in the way of surgery to fix type 2 diabetes, which will be different for other disease states. I give you the epidemiology, so the prevalence, some general statistics. Find the statistics that you find are interesting and that really talk about and give you a feel for this disease. A lot of times there's a lot of information about a disease state, so pick out what you think is most important and what really kind of strikes you about this disease. So one thing I want you guys to get is how big and how important is this disease? Is it something rare? Is it something very common? We hear about the flu, and I think around 50, 60 children have died from the flu, which is awful. And as far as childhood deaths, the rates are fairly, well, put it this way, I would imagine there are a lot more children dying from accidental deaths than they are from the flu. We still talk about the flu, but you want to compare it to what else is going on. How big is this problem compared to other problems? And obviously we don't want children to die. But when you're looking at these numbers, how does this compare to some other numbers, or how big of a problem is it? And to me, the big number that strikes me is this 9.4%, and that number will continue to go up, and it's projected to double and triple by 2030 and 2050. So it's a major issue. I found this slide. This was in your textbook related to the diabetes rates. So you can see that the number is slightly different than the previous chart. The other chart was 9.3. This one's 10.3. And then Mexicans seem to have a higher rate, or have a higher rate than others. But again, it's a chart. You can get this chart from the internet. You can get this chart from the book. Another chart from the book that I thought was interesting, talking about childhood diabetes, relating it to type 1, type 2, children under 10, children over 10. I list the costs. And then I talk a little bit more about lifestyle modification. Not only do I talk about lifestyle modifications, what you should do, but I also talk about the mechanism where it will work. So that the healthy diet, decreased insulin levels. I talk about lifestyle modifications with exercise. And what I basically did was I put probably diabetes, exercise, mechanism. See how this works. See if we get this article. So you find scholarly articles. These are good, and what is nice about this is that it kind of narrows the search. And here we go. This is the article that we want. So luckily we found it very quickly. It took a little bit of a refined search, but not much. You're going to love this article. Okay, so this article talks about the mechanism. What you should do is pick out the fine points, what I have here, from that article, to do it the best that you can. Now, I've looked at this article. I've skimmed the article, in all honesty, which is what I expect you to do as well. And there's aspects of it that I understand. There's aspects of it that I did not understand. And there's aspects of it that I had to look up. Oftentimes they talk about this translocation. I know translocation means going from one place to another. Like, at least that's what kind of logically you would think. But I had to look it up to see exactly what it was discussing, because it didn't quite make sense to me. And basically what it means is that these GLUT4 transporters are within the cell, and that this signaling causes the GLUT4 molecules to proteins to go to the cell surface, the cell membrane, and that's what lets glucose into the cell. So I wasn't quite sure what they were talking about, but I investigated it a little bit further to see what exactly was going on. You should do the same. If it's not making sense, you could either ask me, email me, and really the first thing you should do is try to look it up and find the answer for yourself. So sometimes you're still questioning it, and I know if I would have read this article and I would have, before the internet, this was a big issue for me. I would see this GLUT4 translocation. I'd be racking my brain to figure out what the heck is that. So make sure that if you don't understand something, you don't just kind of accept it, but you try to look it up and get a better understanding of what's going on. And I would imagine that you could find YouTube videos on this as well. Let's do that. And then we have some nice videos now. This might be something that you understand, you don't understand. I would watch a few of them to kind of get a feel for, okay, what exactly is this talking about? Especially if you're kind of fuzzy with the first video. But you can see you can get a better understanding of what's going on and how exercise is creating that mechanism. And then this, again, is a graph from the textbook. Lifestyle modification, mindfulness, and prevention. So things like meditation, and how is its mechanism. So you should talk about kind of how these things are working. So I have this lifestyle. How does it how do the ways we live affect chances of getting the disease? What are other factors? And I don't list it here, but I think you should consider it. I think it'll make it much better. Is to find a mechanism, and if you don't understand the mechanism, you could state that. If you can't find a mechanism, you can state that as well. But a lot of times, it's not about really understanding the mechanism. I mean, that's the cherry on top, icing on the cake. But it's realizing that there is a mechanism, that scientists have kind of figured this out, or at least partially figured it out, which says, okay, there is truth to this. It's not just somebody's opinion. How smoking is related and alcohol consumption, part of that's related to inflammation. And then also monitoring your type 2 diabetes, monitoring your blood sugar is key to treatment. Genetics and the environment, I talk about the genetic factors as well as environmental factors, which again are things that I list here. And then the next one, so you can see life with diabetes. Life with diabetes. How does it affect your ability to live? Now there's a lot of things here. I don't expect you to address everything that's here, but at least address the key things or the things that you feel are the most important. So first, consider what the people look like. What are their major issues? So these things go hand in hand for the most part. And then the issues that will face the individual: medications, doctor's visits, medical costs, depression. Changing your lifestyle is difficult. Decreasing your ability to complete tasks that have a physical component. And that's largely due to partially managing your blood sugar, as well as partially due to the fact that the individual is obese, most likely to start with. Whoops. Yeah, this is a new slide. Well, it looks like I copied the slide twice. But the individual effects on exercise, the individual will have to start slow. The goal should be regular exercise. Both strength training and aerobic training are beneficial. And then addressing complications. So the effects of exercise, or the effects on exercise, largely it's this interaction between diabetes, exercise, and complications. So what is going on, or what do you need to watch out for if the individual has a complication? And then I have some research articles. Again, try to provide the I provided that research article or review article earlier, but also provide that bibliography, which is missing here. I also just did a generalized search just to show you that the amount of information on this is just massive. Basically 150,000 articles, 27,500 of those articles are review articles, where they're taking all the research and kind of developing a thesis or themes based on previous research. So there's a lot of information. The big study that I talked about is the diabetes prevention program. I think that's kind of, in my mind, for our field, that's the biggest and most important study, which showed that diet and exercise will decrease the risk, and it'll decrease the risk more than the drug group, the metformin group. And this is from that. Then I listed some potential studies. So this is the last group, the fact-checking and finding information. I put together, and I want you guys to do this as well, is to show, okay, how would we use a cross-sectional study to relate it to type 2 diabetes? How would we use a case control study associated with type 2 diabetes? So in this, I mentioned something that's moderately rare is an amputation. So finding a group of people, if you wanted to do a cohort study, of free living people, even free living people with diabetes, it's more difficult to see, okay, well, how many of those people will get an amputation. It's quicker and easier and cheaper just to already look at the people that have already had an amputation. What makes them different than other type 2 diabetics? And then a cohort study, look at physically fit young people, people like you, and see if they get type 2 diabetes over a lifetime. That's going to take time. And then a clinical trial looking at exercise and how that would affect different parameters of type 2 diabetes. So if you're administering some sort of intervention, you have a control group and you have a intervention group, and you're seeing how do those compare. And I think that might be it. Yeah. So you can include this information, especially when you mention the topic and do the lecture. But when in doubt, list things. And if you're not finding information, mention that as well. So it tells me that, hey, I searched the heck out of this and I couldn't find anything. And that's okay. A lot of times you will find that. So, but make sure that you mention that is the case. And I think that's it. Okay, that's it.